buenos días o buenas tardes a todas y todos los que nos están escuchando desde distintos lugares del mundo. Quiero agradecer una vez más a todo el personal de la UNTREF y de UNTREF Media que hace posible esta transmisión. Quiero agradecerle también a la Asociación Lengua de Señas que hace posible que esta reunión haya podido
to get translated, as was the case with other previous meetings, to include a new member or a new audience who didn't have access to these cultural transmissions. And I'd like to, of course, thank you all who have made it possible, together with our presence, to have a meeting like the one we're having. This meeting continues the cycle of the 5 previous meetings, thinking about possible futures. Thinking about possible futures was the way that we thought about moving forward with our biennial efforts in this framework, where it wasn't possible for us to carry out big face-to-face meetings as we would do in the past. But through virtual means, we managed to keep it possible to think what will happen in what has been given the following name, new normal, or what is it that we want to happen in the new normal? Because as we all know and as we all think, this pandemic, additionally to the health effects, has had a number of other effects that are very deepening. They have deepened out a number of problems that already existed in connection to having a more serious social crisis, gender crisis or divides, and many other things that we could refer to. This is why we think it is really important for us to think about how we can contribute so that this normality that is happening in pandemic will be one that will not make previous problems. The title we've given to this meeting, making the margins and turning them into a center, is not all that original. Because, I mean, of course, everything has to do with this. How do we go about so that those that have been considered margins in the world of culture, how do they become a center? This is one of the key objectives, one of the key goals in BIENALSUR. It's an undertaking that precisely so is focused on the margins. And this has been run, as you all very well know, it's addressed to people. And for this reason, we haven't focused, as in many other biennials, in reaching the audience of a given city or to art tourism who hop around from events, but rather having one that is basically targeted and be well known by the number of people of the places where we represent. So we have a level of participation. Those venues, those people, and those people will have a very different participation. This will be my final remark before I give the floor to Diana, who is the artistic and an academic director of this biennial, so that she gets started with the discussion. But I was saying that on the video that will be shown on Barthélemy Thébault, he makes reference to Senghor, and in a way, this has a lot to do with the spirit of the biennial, because the background, though may be challenged because of a number of things, tried to merge the African culture with that of the North. So, well, I thought it would be important to make reference to this, because I personally have always had very much in mind Senghor's postures and work as one of the so many examples that have to be followed. I say this irrespective of the fact that, as any other person who has a very hectic and active life, of course, there might be other aspects in his background that may be giving a path into discussion. Without any further ado, Diana, I'll give the floor to you. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. There is an aspect that resurfaces in these meetings to think about possible futures and others that we have, and in texts that we all get to read, that tend to think about this continuous present in the reality we are at. And in these series of texts, there is something that appears and repeats itself time and time again: the critique to what we call the previous normality. Of course, we agree on it. BIENALSUR, as a matter of fact, was born as a result of how we critiqued the dynamics of the international art system. But in the sequence of the dialogues that we have had so far, we realized that there are a number of projects of which you are representatives individually that had been developed and been created for quite a long time, and that you can show the good practices or the good roadmaps that can be followed. I mean, this is from the following sense: the critical remark on the past that brought us to the situation where we are at right now should also be the one that will help us recover good practices, those looks or outlooks where it would be worth deepening on. This is the reason why we are bringing together all of you around this quote-unquote table, this virtual table. This is a normality we wouldn't like to grow used to. I mean, we don't want to have only these type of meetings, even though we recognize how productive they are and how good they are in helping us keep thinking together. Along those lines, I'd like you to join me in watching this video, this material that Bartolomito sent over to us, so that we will then give the floor to Ana Longoni so we get started in this round of presentations. Let me share the screen with you.
Banjul Station is rooted in the Bamileke Highlands in Cameroon. This art center started with an observation: classical African art can be found in Western museums today. This phenomenon is reproduced with contemporary art, which is also in hands of the West, because there is no real art market on the African continent, and no more political will to create museums, which would prevent the works from escaping. It was therefore necessary to create a space where the works of contemporary African artists could be exhibited as part of ambitious cultural projects. Better yet, it seemed important to me that these works be associated with those of artists from all over the world, in a spirit of dialogue and sharing of cultures. Banjul Station has a growing permanent collection nourished by exchanges and donations. The collection comprises 1,125 works, the vast majority of which originate from exchanges with artists and collectors. It includes paintings by Solis Cissé or Dominique Singpe, as well as drawings by Louis Bourgeois, lithographs by Miró and Tapies, a sound sculpture by Laurie Anderson. One of the vocations of Banjul Station is education and the transmission of knowledge. Yes, we have a whole educational component aimed at school children in the region. We also function as a residence for artists and curators. Their projects must be carried out in conjunction with local communities, because we do not want to function as an island. Banjul Station has the ambition to be at the same time an artistic, social, and what is more singular still, agricultural structure. We have started our own production of organic coffee. This constitutes for us a strong political and critical act, which amplifies the artistic act, and which is in line with what Leopold Sédar Senghor called the deterioration of the terms of trade, when export prices set by the West penalize and impoverish the farmers of the South. The agricultural component. In this section, we chose coffee. We have received nurseries from the Cameroonian state of a variety called Java, and Arabica grows well on the hills of Banjul. This project is based on the criticism of North-South exchanges. We tried to follow the chain from production to distribution, because farmers in third world countries do not follow the whole chain. They produce the raw material, and the state is the one which then sells for export. And as the African states do not have so much power at the level of the world market, they stop at the stage of the sale of the raw material to the West, who take the opportunity to buy at very low prices, which impoverish them, southern farmers. In the villages of Western Cameroon, farmers abandoned coffee cultivation because it was not profitable. They preferred to tear off the feet of coffee trees to plant cassava or corn, something to eat, for their survival. I wanted to criticize this situation of imbalance. That's why I decided to create our own nursery and cultivate by going to the finished product, focusing on organic quality and offering lithographed packaging, signed and numbered, to be able to set the price for our production ourselves. The COVID-19 has triggered synchronized containment around the world. I went through a phase of bewilderment, since my projects scheduled for the second semester were postponed. It resulted in fruitless babbling to generate creative force. Everything was slowing down. I was in Cameroon for more than 3 months, with very limited means to meet my production, the demands. My confinement outside my studio has increased my concerns, lengthened the interaction times with all my interlocutors abroad, and my reading of the world. Agriculture and work in the fields at Banjul Station, my commitment to the inhabitants, allowed me to invest my energy in people and the health crisis. These include financial and moral support, distribution of foodstuffs, masks, hydroalcoholic gel. I recommend Albert Camus's book, Discours de Suède, 1957, Gallimard Folio, 2017. Because in this book, L'Esthétique de Camus insists on the obligations of art. He makes works of voices forced by the tumult of history. That is to say, obliged not to take sides, but to be part, to be taken in the midst of all, to understand.
Well, the project by Barthélemy Lemaitre is a place that has lots of convergence points in our present. When Barthélemy Togo sent over this material, he chose a number of points that we had been discussing on in order to organize it into these 5 moments, so to speak. I leave this open to Anna's presentation so that we may go back to this all together. Thank you, Diana. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to engage in conversation with all of you. I'll very briefly present a few ideas or points to open up discussion. The first thing has to do with the title of our meeting, making the margins into a center and problematizing or rethinking the unidirectional nature at which unidirectional flows happen from north to south, from the center to the periphery. This is how hegemonic narratives have been built, art history, and this is also the case in the system of art. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the possibility of imagining escaping from some binomials that are quite there, from local to global. So this is to make the exercise to open up a deconfigured map without a center, decentralized. And in Spanish, it has a double sense. It's polyphonic in a way, and I'd like to go back to this. Whatever is decentered, it doesn't recognize a center, but it is kind of bewildered. It kind of reshuffles the previous map, the habitual hegemonic map. And on those lines, a good way to deconfigure center and periphery relations could stem not so much from considering how to include peripheries on the central narratives or claim that missing chapter in hegemonic narratives, but rather thinking about other ways to think or have a position or configure our own experience that will challenge radically the very same hegemonic central narrative, that is not to recognize the center, but rather to challenge it, to do so radically based on our experiences and our practices. And along those lines, I'd like to introduce another issue that is related to this, which has to do with the dimension of scales, which is something key to think about local and global. A while ago, I was reading a book by Maria Todorova, a historian from Bulgaria. She wrote a lot about the Balkans. And I was thinking about what she refers to as a change in scale. It is not a naive exercise or neutral for that matter, and it upsets in a drastic manner any narrative that will stem from such a scale. That is an interesting issue to consider in us thinking about how, if you have a chance on changing the scale, you can find a way into reconsidering the real connections and the possibilities of imaginary connections or toward connections, desired connections with other communities and other territories and other subjects and other experiences alike. So based on this framework, maybe one to move from this binomial center-periphery, but in changing the scale, based on these two ideas, I'd like to very briefly discuss, because I don't have that many minutes assigned to me, so I can give some space to other colleagues. I'd like to talk about two dimensions, how I regard this possibility in the policies that we are developing at the Reina Sofia Museum. As you well know, it is not a periphery museum, not at all. It is quite central. It is mainstream, and it has a lot of legitimacy. So what about scales? It's a big
con tanta capacidad de legitimación y de construcción del relato cuando se plantea estos cambios de escala o estas posibilidades de descentramiento, ¿no? Y en ese sentido voy a compartir pantalla para mostrarles la página web del museo en la que van a poder bucear por estas ideas que estoy aquí sintetizando a vuelo de pájaro con mayor detalle. Por un lado, en todo lo que llamamos museo en red, que es lo que yo llamaría un laboratorio por una nueva institucionalidad. Y es digamos, un conjunto de experimentos de colaboración de diferentes escalas, justamente, que intentan sostener a largo plazo y de manera persistente y permanente diálogos en el tiempo con diferentes colectivos, ¿no? Que son colectivos artísticos, pueden ser instituciones o grupos de artistas, pueden ser museos o pueden ser colectivos de curadores o de arte, pero también son colectivos activistas, puede incluir desde una librería como Traficantes de Sueño hasta un colectivo de investigación, o son también colectivos de pensamiento, ¿no? Tienen diferentes caracteres y escalas de intervención. Y me parece que todas estas redes con las que venimos colaborando sostenidamente nos plantean, por un lado, la idea de los límites porosos del museo, el museo como un museo que se abre y se expone a la contaminación, al contacto, a poder ser permeado y penetrado y habitado por la posibilidad de construir proyectos comunes con estos sujetos que configuran también públicos inesperados, públicos no habituales. Y ahí me gusta mucho algo que Manolo Borja insiste mucho, que es pasar de la noción del visitante del museo a la noción del habitante, aquel que lo habita cotidianamente, que lo siente como un territorio común, un territorio de todas, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, el museo imaginado como un lugar de aprendizajes múltiples, inesperados, un lugar de puesta en cuestión de las formas de representación habituales, pero también un lugar de puesta en crisis de las formas de enunciación habituales, ¿no? Un museo que se quiere feminista y un museo que se quiere decolonial, y todo lo que eso implica como ejercicio cotidiano de puesta en cuestión y autocrítica de todos los lugares desde donde se erigen los lugares de enunciación, ¿no? Un museo también como un archivo no cerrado y no ensimismado, sino completamente interpelable y abierto a seguir siendo completado y diseminado, ¿no? en usos múltiples. Y en ese sentido, un museo que no configura un relato patrimonial, sino que más bien aspira a ser un museo del común. Me parece que esta noción de lo común, que es una noción en la que venimos insistiendo mucho, es clave, también para salirnos de otro par muy habitual, que es el par público-privado, ¿no? Pensar desde la noción de lo común abre una brecha para imaginar otros modos de construcción de relatos y de tomas de posición y de archivos y de circulación de producciones artísticas y producciones culturales. Las redes con las que colabora el museo, muy sintéticamente solo las voy a enunciar aquí, pero si ustedes después quieren bucearlas pueden recorrer la página del museo y podemos conversarlo más adelante. Tienen diferentes escalas. Por un lado está la internacional, que es una red de 9 museos europeos, que ya lleva 12 años de proyectos comunes y que ahora está investigando sobre los años 90, el post-89, qué significa eso a nivel de imaginar nuestras Europas, así se llama el proyecto, nuestras muchas Europas, pero también la Fundación de los Comunes, que implica una escala a nivel del Estado Nacional, con un conjunto de activismos y de iniciativas que están en Málaga, en Madrid y en otras partes de España. La red Conceptualismos del Sur, que es una red de la cual soy una de las impulsoras y que está situada fundamentalmente en América Latina, con más de 50 o 60 casi investigadores, artistas que la impulsamos. El Instituto de Imaginación Radical, que está más bien situado en el entorno del Mediterráneo, con una serie de iniciativas artísticas, pero también de pensamiento y de activismo en torno a esa gran frontera de la fortaleza europea y toda la cuestión migratoria, que es hoy una de las grandes crisis que afectan, ¿no?, el modelo de la fortaleza europea. Y la última red que se ha sumado a esta iniciativa y de la cual también estamos impulsando desde sus inicios, que es una red feminista de espacios de investigación feminista en América Latina, en Medio Oriente y en Europa, llamada La Laboratoria. Particularmente voy a usar el par de minutos que me quedan para presentarles Museo Situado, que es una red que tiene 2 años de edad, poco más, y que implica un trabajo con la escala de lo más inmediato y local del museo, que es el entorno del barrio de Lavapiés, que es un barrio popular, de vieja tradición activista, con muchísima autoorganización y una larga tradición de colectivos migrantes y de colectivos artísticos que la habitan, pero también es un barrio que ha sido fuertemente afectado por la gentrificación turística en los últimos años y que por lo tanto está expulsando a sus viejos habitantes por el encarecimiento así abismal de su vivienda. Y con esos habitantes que están atravesados por estos múltiples conflictos y que en el medio de la situación de la pandemia se vieron urgidos por una situación atravesada por el hacinamiento de la vivienda, por la falta de trabajo de todos los que tienen empleos informales o que viven en el día a día, o todas las personas que no tienen papeles y por lo tanto no tenían derecho a pedir subsidio de desempleo, etc. Esas múltiples urgencias que atraviesan este entorno local del museo han sido, creo que, puestas de relieve en todas las políticas
underscored in all the policies that we have developed from the museum in the last few pandemic months. Situated Museum, it works based on an assembly with the participation of around 20 groups with migrants, artists, and activists against gentrification or in favor of being inhabited by all feminist groups that inhabit this neighborhood. And it's been a very good listening exercise to give way to the demands and the initiatives and the distrusts that the neighborhood transverses into this big space that is unaffordable considering the more immediate surrounding. These demands have been multiple. They have invited people to carry out picnics with the neighbors on the museum's gardens, with 400 people attending in 2018 and 600 in 2019. This year, regretfully, we had to call it off. We also had visits commented in migrant languages, discussions as the ones we are having on Zoom on how we are being affected by the pandemic, workshops such as the one we did with the Argentine collective, echoing urgent campaigns to register formally citizens that are informally living in situations, or also with an Argentine poet who from Buenos Aires issued a very good book, a wonderful book, in connection to the death of Mohammed Hussein, who died of COVID without any medical care because of the lack of understanding, because he couldn't speak Spanish good enough to healthcare providers. I don't want to make any more use of the time assigned. There are a few more things that you can browse on the museum's webpage. Well, this initiative that we entitled Situated Museum in connection to the feminist theory and the situated knowledge by Donna Haraway in the well-known or popularly renamed
como agujerear el museo es una metáfora muy precisa de esa porosidad de la que hablaba hace un ratito, ¿no? De esa idea de un museo que deja de ser impenetrable para para habilitar la posibilidad de construir flujos de ida y vuelta, puentes, agujeros, túneles que habiten el museo con estas nuevas demandas, urgencias y modos de vida. Con eso termino y agradezco mucho este espacio para plantear, aunque sea someramente, los modos en que estamos trabajando en diferentes escalas esta posibilidad de repensar el museo que hoy creo que se vuelve perentoria. Muchas gracias.
Sin duda, muchísimas gracias, Ana. Cedemos la palabra a otro espacio situado y muy querido, además por nosotros, como es la Escuela Superior de Bellas Artes de Lima, a Carlos Valdés.
Buenas tardes ya con todos. Acá en Lima son las 10 de la mañana. El agradecimiento por hacerme parte de este sexto encuentro, haciendo del margen el centro. Y bueno, comenzar diciendo de que Perú está conformado, como muchos ya lo saben, por una variedad muy interesante a nivel cultural. Tenemos desde culturas indígenas, llamadas andinas, amazónicas, también tenemos una fuerte población afrodescendiente, asiática también, porque Perú estuvo siempre conectado a nivel del Océano Pacífico en un flujo que no solamente es con Europa, que se dio básicamente a través de la colonización, y además, obviamente, por una fuerte mezcla, ¿no es cierto?, a partir de la migración europea, ¿no es cierto?, en Perú. Entonces hay una rica variedad que además, en estas tensiones que yo agregaría para este diálogo, ¿no?, como mirar las tensiones entre centro y periferia, entre lo oficial y lo no oficial, ¿no? En el caso peruano también hay una fuerte tensión entre lo estatal y lo no estatal, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y en lo que es centralista, porque el Perú es un país sumamente centralista, versus lo que no es el centro.
Centrality oriented vis-a-vis the non-center in Peru. So when we think about these different tensions, we get to see some sort of stratified society. We're quite reticulated on a number of different aspects. This has to do with culture, post-colonialism, the structure of the state itself, the structure of society, and of course, this shows how Peruvians regard themselves. And in my own case, I speak from the School of Fine Arts in Lima. This is one that has just turned its 100th anniversary. It was created with a long connection to canons, you know, to heritage and whatnot. So we wanted to focus on the lines that Ana Longoni was talking about, reinventing, opening up the pores to everything that could be playing with the canon, opening it up, discussing it, challenging it, generating more canons in order to include the variety of the population the institution has. Because since we are a state institution, there is a strong population who migrate from all over the country and who have perspectives, a number of different perspectives in connection to art and in connection to their perspectives of arts in general. So we thought for this reinvention of fine arts, we thought that this could have a very contextualized look. The world has definitely changed in the last few years. From 2001 on, I mean, we had in 2001 the Twin Tower effect. That showed the beginning of the cycle. It is a very strong effect. And of course, it removed this tension of fundamentalism vis-a-vis a highly liberal society. And I believe that without a doubt, it showed quite a big challenge for a school of thought that could no longer stay on canons or on institutions as an element behind closed doors. We rather had to look for a way of convincing people or persuading people, not doing it from the top down, but rather from the grassroots, how to go about convincing the number of players that such need was there in place. Our strategy has been therefore to generate internal dynamics in the institution in and of itself, first and foremost, by calling out the participation of contemporary courses together with more traditional or classical courses on fine arts, because in Peru, there is a strong expectation on a number of types of highly objectual art, modernity, so to speak. So our curriculum has been in a tension between a more modern proposal and a postmodern one that has to do with gestures. So there is a coexistence between a number of more modernist outlooks vis-a-vis practices that focus on community art, relational art, the public space, and then we can go on to actionism and whatnot. There are quite a number of proposals. They used to be individual proposals, but we believe that we have a number of tensions, and these are typical of the logic of fine arts. Even though it is a state-run institution, it considers a necessary contextualization of its doing, so to speak, and a necessary permanent reinvention. We have to reinvent ourselves. In the past, we only thought about how creative projects or pieces were all about, but today we know it has to do with creative leadership, creative curatorship management, and in how we propose, how do you relate to the audience? And when it's time for that, then we are placed in the historical center of Lima. And as is typically the case, of course, there are a number of social and economic factors that come to play. And in a way, this has an impact on the population that live nearby. So we wanted to reconnect with our close surrounding. Initially, I was talking about the internal dynamic movements in the institution. We also wanted, as Ana Longoni was saying, we didn't come that far as to invite people into picnics, but we did engage with them. We invited school children, basic education level. We invited them to come over on a regular basis so that they would participate in our workshops. And we've already visited those schools ourselves. We have opened up to public squares with our graduated students, and this is like the second level of insertion and contextualization. I also wanted to comment about this multicultural nature, this interculturality. This is some sort of wealth, so to speak, that Peru has, having incorporated art, traditional art as we call it in Peru. These are related to more ancestral knowledge, so to speak. So we've had a professor from the Shipibo Conibo ethnic group who taught Amazonic textile production, also a professor from the Huanca culture who teaches us the use of a very traditional object, mate burinado is called. And we also are working with a traditional pottery worker. So it's not just from the modernity of art or from post-modernity, but we also are generating another tension with more local and more traditional or ancestral art. And we believe that this may be some sort of similarity of what is happening outside from the art institution. Outside from the art institution, there is a social dynamic in Latin America that generates responses, inventions. People don't expect governments to work out those problems, their own personal or family problems. In Latin America, the social dynamic causes for answers to be given by others. So we wanted the same logic to be part of our institution so that these sections could be the driving force behind our reinvention, so we can have a good context with the current world today. This is as far as I wanted to cover from my Peruvian perspective. I give the floor to whomever will follow me. Thank you, Carlos. Francis, would you like to follow? Good afternoon, of course, it will be my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me this space and for this initiative that you are setting in motion. It is very relevant indeed, especially considering the times we are living through. Well, my participation will be split into two parts. On the one hand, I'll be summarizing some ideas in connection to what has been considered as the premise of the meeting. And on the other hand, I'll show and let you know something about the promotion of our project, Francis Naranjo. So as time will run short, and given the circumstances, well, I just jotted a number of bullet points that I wanted to cover because I thought were important to share with you. Under the understanding that what we are considering is something quite complex in its own nature. And I stem on from the idea that talking about periphery is talking about something that would only be understood as in contraposition to centrality. But if we fine-tune what we are treating, gets complicated. If centrality, the Western world, sets out guidelines replicated around the world, especially now with these new communication models, it is my understanding that the distance between these two criteria is shrunk and shrunk ever more. But there continues to be a cultural structure based on these behaviors that stem from the political power. It is my inference that it has to do with a mindset, the difference between periphery and the center. When we talk about the margins of these mental ideas, we think about remote, neglected territories, as has been mentioned by you all, and as we watched on Barthelemy's video. But it is this reason why I understand that the spaces that yet remain unsolved can be found in places like this, and maybe the territories to charter will find that the method is the trip. We have to have borders in mind, frontiers that show a signal for thinking and that turn it into an erratic experience, forcing us to go through the paths around the world. The modern passion of traveling has to do with an inside travel, trying to be humans, owners of the world. The new, the experience in the outside, and going from the outside to within, arriving at a different world. The limits are not very well limited. A Block would call them the utopic periphery. We could then open up to reflecting upon the future, but it is not an abstract, rootless future, rather potentiating the possibility of designing a modern world to reach an existence that will be ruled by reason, freedom, and happiness. The understanding of the dialectic nature of history involves a decisive issue, human fate as an open issue, and in turn, the human condition as something quite complex indeed. In front of the paralysis and the decay produced by traditional culture and the turmoil of this crisis, we find the alternative, the revolution, a face that turns to the back and another one that is turned into the future. We are forced and interested in thinking that neither human beings or the world is over yet, but there is something that buzzes in my mind while I think of these ideas: failure. Maybe the alternative is to admit to it, reflect upon this abstract term, but yet so constructive indeed. It is my understanding that we are very many artists who are attentive to the process, and this is why my inference shows me that there are multiple paths, and this can enrich in the construction of these ideas. Also accepting the idea of failure, it can enrich in our existence and our circumstances. These are just some thoughts that I aim at when thinking about the idea of periphery as a feeling. And now I will briefly talk about something that has to do with our project in the Francis Moranco Foundation. It's through a cooperation agreement with Las Palmas Ayuntamiento in the Canary Islands. Initially, we had to start the project in the foundation in April. That coincided with the breakdown of this pandemic, and it got deferred to July. So we are quite thrilled with the project, where we will dynamize, so to speak, or encourage the context of Las Palmas in the Grand Canary Islands. And I'll show you a very short video with the spaces that will be available to us. And I will also talk, while I'll show you the images, some of our working methodology. Let me share the screen with you. We are scheduling in a place like this, the Castillo de Mata Museum, through the collaboration with the Ayuntamiento. We feel privileged because it is a space, a remarkable one, that has a very powerful personality that brings together very singular characteristics in order to start the project that we intend to consolidate here. Please remember that the Canary Islands, the closest island to Africa, is situated less than 100 kilometers away. But the city where I am at is 1,700 kilometers away from Madrid. Of course, our feeling is one of roots with very singular behaviors. We are deeply rooted. We, those who live in the Canary Islands, feel very much related to South American people. I speak the way you listen to me speak, and we speak in a very different way from those who live on the peninsula. We keep in touch with Latin America, culturally and socially. We have these spaces, which, as you can readily see, are quite singular. They have 3 rooms for exhibitions. We have opened already initially in July, early in July. The first 3 exhibitions were opened in July, and we will do this in tandems by 3. Our relation with Latin America is fundamental in all of our proposal. As a matter of fact, in these 3 exhibitions, I should say that 85% of participating artists are South American. We want to relate, in the Canary Islands, additionally to being very close to Africa, we've always turned our backs to Africa. Spain has always turned its back to Spain. We have to admit to that. Let me show you the model. We have, you may have taken a look at the spaces. We feel privileged because these are spaces that have these characteristics. They may dignify the creative format, and we want to also dignify the cultural format on the Canary Islands in our proposal that will be multicultural in nature. And as I was saying, we have opened 3 exhibitions. The participation of Latin American artists is fundamental, and it'll always be so. Because we will be the next year, the venue of BIENALSUR, it'll be our honor to be the venue, and our schedule, our program will pivot around this. Our project is in turn to engage in dialogue with local cultures, with cultures that will be close to our territory, and to engage in dialogue with Latin American cultures. I think it is fundamental, as Carlos was saying, to relate these practices that are related to popular art or those formulations that have to do with ancestral notions and contemporary art. And their potential is quite remarkable. One of the exhibitions that are opened right now that is called The Social Mask. One of the pieces is from a Peruvian artist that is called Claudio Jimenez Quispe, who knows about the whole thing. And I think it is absolutely essential to engage in dialogue with contemporary artists with great potential, as could be the case of Leonardo Anzum and any others, or Loxe or Juan Castillo. And there are pieces by Julia Isidre from Paraguay. She does popular pottery. She is engaging in major art. And this has to be localized and renamed from a different perspective. I was making reference to failure, and it has to do with failure of what we construe of as art or contemporary culture. We should do a lot of rethinking, especially about these components that have to do with expiration dates and contemporaneity, with contemporary thought. I don't want to take any time longer than assigned. Maybe later, after all have participated, we can go deeper into some notions, but these are broadly speaking the notions of what I wanted to share with you. The Canary Islands is a territory that has traditionally been inhabited by migrant people from the first few times when we were colonized. Canary slaves moved here so that we could with them populate other territories such as Uruguay or Texas. I'll give the floor to the next speaker, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and for inviting me to participate. I wanted to reinforce the notion on Claudio Jimenez, as you've just mentioned him. Claudio Jimenez Quispe, an Ayacuchano artist who works in a format that is very related to political violence in Peru. He does traditional art. He's a very interesting artist. It's great that you have a chance and work with him. Yes, it's quite interesting indeed. I found him, I discovered him in fair in Santiago, Chile. And it's quite interesting because I think he doesn't do any crafts. He does major art. He does, art, grand and big. Well, in Peru, there is a book the difference between art, popular art, and craftsmanship. Of course, it has to do with classes and ethnicity. Many times we do show that difference, the taxonomy does exist. Yes, that's really true. Thank you. Carlos, I was thinking about the experience last year with a collection of fine arts. It is one that invites us into rethinking about the canon based on its variety and complexity. What are the copycats we should expect to find, and all other copycats, so to speak, from the Andean culture, and contemporary productions that go back to those traditions and rethink them or explode them, materially speaking and conceptually speaking. And all these paths are quite interesting, and they can be thought of based on these decentralized perspectives. This is how we engaged in the dialogue with each and every one of you. And Anna, in the beginning, talked about this. I got a message by someone who said that he couldn't really listen to your first part in good detail. Since the last reference was in Chile, I'll give the floor to Sebastian Calfuqueo. Hello to you all. I'm Sebastián Calfuqueo. I'm an artist. I'd like to talk about my presentation to Machi Celestino Córdoba, who has been for over 100 days in a hunger strike because the state doesn't respond to international agreements that are not respected in Chile. The rights of native people are always vulnerated, so to speak.
Bueno, yo voy a comenzar.
I'll get started by talking briefly about my piece. I'd like to thank BIENALSUR for inviting me, for enabling it to make it possible to link territories. I was telling Diana that it was quite nice to connect the historical Mapuche territory, which is not Chile. I come from Guaymapu, which is part of Argentina, part of the Patagonia. There's lots of territories that have been devoid of their hands, that have been taken away from their hands. My work has been developed in a number of formats. I do pottery. I do also photography. I do performance, performative art, and installations. I also shoot videos. And I am keenly interested in approaching the concept of identity, so to speak, with a critical regard, reducing class and gender. What about sexuality, the concept of nature, and the possibilities of feminism? Everything is defined under parameters related to concepts that have to do with colonialism. Western colonialism indoctrinated us with a thought based on the binomial considerations, opposed considerations, civilized, barbaric, feminine, masculine, euphoria, dysphoria, white and black, among others. The species are not binomial in nature. We move down the waters that are adapted to a number of containers of our experiences and bodily nature. I wanted to show you the project Konye Weichan, which is the struggle of water, from translation from the Mapuche language. This is an exhibition that disrupted or that got interrupted with COVID pandemic. It continues to be up, but cannot be finalized because the consequences of virus have brought us to the lockdown that we have been in for the last few months in Santiago. This has been curated by Christian Cayahueque on my piece in a metropolitan gallery, an independent space that is quite remarkable in Santiago in Chile, that has featured a number of proposals in connection to political art and the relation among the different communities. The first piece is called Kota Mapungeka, water is also territory, is the translation. It shows the relation, the poetic and political relation around water, my body, in the Mapuche language and the territory, in a combination of techniques. The installation invites you to go through the toponymics of water, Cogeco, Haihuco, Renaiko, among other ways, and the insisting writing on pieces of fabric that say, earth doesn't dry on its own, others make it dry. The map of the territory that is Chile today, and also some of the Articles 5 and 6 from the Code of Water in 1961, in the middle of the dictatorship by Pinochet, and the Constitution and Code of Water continues to rule our lives in the territory this day and age. Other pieces that are part are opened up potteries, water pieces. This is ceramics in different shades of blues. Some have the text, dry, droughts, ransack, and Eloica Leifu. Eloica is a territory in Chile that has no water because of extractivism and capitalism that rules the area, leaving the people without any water. But avocado is the single crop that is developed on this territory and that doesn't allow people to have free access to water. The piece challenges the historical relations between water and the Mapuche people in connection to neoliberal extractivism and the privatizing model of water. Water has been a central model in my last few pieces because there is a constant relation in the configuration of colonialism and nature, how from the implementation of this colonial model, nature is no space where people can coexist with one another, but on the contrary, it is something that has been there to be exploited. Chile is the only country in the world who has its water privatized. Water is the commodity that is sold in the market as any other commodity, and communities have no human or legal right to water. This piece had a performance component, a performatic component with two single crop themes, pine and another one from Bio Bio, from the south area down in the Chile territory, is planted by pine trees, by forestal extractivist companies that have eradicated with a lot of territory, and the Chile state pays this with our tax payments, and they keep devastating all the other conceivable forms of life in our territory. Kokulen is another piece. It's a companion piece in this exhibition. This is a bodily, personal, poetic journey on waters, the wetlands, the lakes, the oceans, the rivers, and the streams of water. This approaches the body, binomial notions, gender, sexuality, historical relations of water and life, and its potential as a living space. This is necessary for all territories, and all forms of life are required for us to understand that our existence is not just anthropocentric, but of those who inhabit the world without imposing ones over others. My work, I don't define it from one single space or from two spaces for that matter. It is a space in constant motion. It doesn't want to be certain on anything, but rather to challenge the order imposed on us by colonialism and patriarchy. That is it. Tight Malcolm Tuche.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And then the last presentation of this first round, we give the floor to Chantal Pontbriand and her project that is also decentralized.
Okay. Thank you, Anibal. Thank you, Diana. And thank you to all my colleagues. I'm happy to meet you. And also to all the people out there listening to us today. This is a wonderful example of how we can proactive in the art world in the difficult times. I want to comment first on a few keywords that I identified in your presentation, Anibal and Diana, from a viewpoint that has sort of always been the one retrospectively that I've adopted in my work, which is this keyword, which is what is to be done. I think when we're thinking possible futures, it's asking ourselves how we can act with parameters of the changes going on in the world in our minds. So those parameters, from my point of view, are what is the contemporary and what is the common. Always trying to deal with those questions of what is happening now and what effect does it have on our common space and our being together, and what how can we create a dialogical space always, and not, as Anna was saying, I think a hegemonic space, which is very much endemic to the legacy of how our institutions have been working in the last centuries. In the very cacophonic world that we are experiencing right now, I would go along the lines of Donna Haraway, who has a keyword that she often brings to the surface, which is stay with the trouble. We have to learn to work in this new world and to work in its chaos and to make something new of it. We have to think that this chaos is a new world, and that we will never come back to the past, but that we are there, all of us, to build a future. I think when we think of this concept, which is art, it's important in that context that we approach it with different stages. We have to understand that we're dealing with a polyphony, with a plurality, and that the only way to deal with that is to put ourselves always in a dialogic position with others, with situations. Donna Haraway and Anna was referring to this, always speaks of situations or situated knowledge. I think knowledge has to be situated. I think we cannot separate today the different types of institutions that are legacies of the past. Museums, events, and live events or so-called festivals, and writing. I think they are not separate, but they must be conceived as working together. And we have to think that all of these different ways of working are mediums in themselves, and that they have a component which is informational, and another component which is communicational. And our work must situate itself like in between always those parameters. And I think in betweenness is really the only way also to deal with this new world, with this chaos. We have to try to see in between and not try to inscribe ourselves or continue working in the normal narratives. That's why I think we're talking more and more about the new normal. We have a theoretician from Argentina, which I guess you know very well, Jorge Duisberg, who termed a coin that I like very much called paramedia. So what we are doing is, in all our work, I believe is very close to this idea of paramedia when we think of our work as dealing with a medium. The other concept I'd like to, by the way, I guess it's quite well known that I created in this sense Parachute magazine here in Montreal, which had as an ambition in the 70s to bridge the different arts that were considered by traditional art history as being separated. I think that new ways of working that came about, such as installation or performance or eventually video, helped to present new forms that had nothing to do with the traditional canons, of course, of art history, and that were more linked to the contemporary and the common. And I think we must always look for those new forms that come out of the in-between. What is not yet known, what is not yet named. So bringing margins to the center, which is another key word of this discussion, means I think not only bringing publics in the margins or identities from the margins to the center, or even people and artists from the margins to the center. I question even the notion of center. Do centers still exist? I think there are constellations and intensities in the world at this point, but that were done with centers. We know we're done with this idea that there were art capitals, Paris, New York. And that's why also I think it was possible to create an international magazine in a place like Montreal, which was not Paris and not New York at the time. To talk just a few minutes about Parachute, it was a magazine also published both in French and in English, because as you know, Montreal is the second largest French-speaking city in the world, which really makes of it a bilingual city in the end, because of the fact that we are in this enormous North American continent where the majority speaks English, which is the case for the world, in fact, right now. So the idea was to bring together two ways of thinking coming from the Francophone world and the Anglo-Saxon world, and to rethink how we can deal with art, rethink the language of art through crossing of these intellectual traditions and others. Of course, I think that already the 20th century was very influenced, for example, by Indian thinking. I think, and Asian thinking in general. I think we have to think that always when we are making a plan, a project, we have to think from the local to the global, and it's a back and forth issue. The only way to learn when you're local is to be global, and the only way to learn when you're global is to be local. I'll come back to these issues when I describe a bit the project I'm working on right now. In your presentation, you talk about identifying the weaknesses. To be short, I'll use a word. I don't like any word in ism, but I'll use this word, conservatism, because I think we have to think that maybe 90% of the art world is working in a conservative fashion. So that means that in order for change to really come about in the art world, there's a lot of work to be done. We're seeing, I think one thing interesting about this pandemic era we are in, and it's not finished, I think, well, all the specialists say that this will be a recurrent phenomenon. And if it's not health problems that surface, it might be like in Lebanon right now, problems that have to do with our post-industrial society and with the world economy, and that create environmental disasters. So I have a feeling that to sort of counter the ambient conservatism, we have to change our focus. We have to change our focus from objects to processes. Because the conservatism is encouraged by stultified forms and concepts. Those that most museums in the world still work with, most biennales still work with. We have to, when I say we have to concentrate on processes, it means that we have to become the medium, we have to become the making of, and that is the only way to move. Moving must be always our preoccupation and our way of working. Another key word in the presentation is fragility. So what is fragilized by this era? Well, I was talking of the art system itself. People in it, mostly, we must think of, are fragilized by it. I think that we have to deal in an important way, in a major way, with the problem of the economy of art, as we do have to deal with the economy of the world. Both go together. So our involvement must be political. It must be, through art, a way of also changing not only the specific economy of art, but the specific economy of the world. We have to reinvent public funding and private funding, which is right now based on certain criteria that are part of an economy which should become obsolete, an economy based on numbers and based on quotas also. And I insist on this second term of quotas because there is right now another sort of peril awaiting us, which is to divide the world in subgroups, in genres, in race, in men and women. I think we must be very aware that that can become problematic in the sense that it can prevent us from going beyond, from going further, and from thinking about possible futures. If we create out of these different subcategories that we're preoccupied with reason, because there's a lot of social justice to be established in this regard. It must not become, we must maintain plurality and a certain dialogical stance and not permit those issues to become stultified in their way. I believe very much in art, as you mentioned, being an open door to creativity, learning, and thinking. That's the only way to be free. But they must not be separated. They must always, our programs or whatever we do, always have to take into account these three pillars of what art is and what can be done with art and by art. The Reina Sofia is a fantastic example of a reinvention of programs in museums, even though I question today even the necessary existence of museums. I've been questioning that for decades, in fact, because I really believe that, you know, for a long time in museums, these public program departments, as they are called today, were called education. It's a very authoritarian model. The idea that you do things in the museum to bring people in. I believe the museum must go out there to where the people are and work with the people where they are and in their contexts. But that's sort of maybe a bit utopian at this point, I admit. And it will already be great if many more museums follow the path, for example, of the Reina Sofia. Bon, I'll talk now about the project which I'm trying to develop at this point here in Montreal. It's called Spheres. It's what I would like to see here happening in this country in order to address all these questions. I was asked 2 years ago or 3 years ago to come to Toronto to develop a new museum there, and well, I did have the chance to do the strategic plan for this museum. And my main idea was that the museum should be everyone's living room. If it's going to be a place of gathering, and if it's going to have any meaning at this point in contemporary times. I also believe that any museum or event, as I said earlier, must be process-oriented. And that institutions, be they museums or events, must be performative at this point. They must move rather than repeat themselves from year to year, as we see most museums repeating themselves, most magazines repeating themselves, most art fairs and biennales repeating themselves. We must always try to foresee change and make change happen inside of whatever we're dealing with. I will share with you my screen also, because at this point we must all be tired of all this talk, including mine. So let me see how I can do this. This will go quickly. Okay. I don't seem to be getting it. Well, so anyway, I'm sorry about that. We should have organized this before. So essentially, again, Toronto came calling. When I was still living in Paris, I spent about 10 years in Europe. And that finished in 2015, and I was just about to move when I got an invitation coming from Toronto. Nobody in Canada knew I was coming back, asking me if I would like to create a biennale for the greater Toronto area. And I said, no, not a biennale, because I think that model is questionable at this point, although it has served, I think, in a quite interesting way, the art world in the last 30, 40 years. But we're now in a new period after 2000 came around, and I really think that we need new institutions and new ways of sort of doing things that can better take into consideration these issues of what is the contemporary, what is the common. So I ended up trying to understand what Toronto had become. It was a very hegemonic city, very Anglo-Saxon. It was nicknamed Toronto the Pure. Was founded by the British when they colonized Canada. It didn't really move much until the end of the 20th century, when all of a sudden important migrations hit Canada. So I did some research and quickly found out that in the 10 years I had been away, and I could feel this whenever I would come back home, Canada had tremendously changed, and it became a country where all of the G7 country, Canada has 22% immigrants, which make up its population. That, we're not counting the children of immigrants that were born here, we're counting only people that were born elsewhere in the world. So there's people from 220 countries that live in Canada at the present time, and Toronto is the city that is number one in when you consider how that demographic phenomenon has changed our cities. Montreal is number two. I'll come back to that. So Toronto now has 53% immigrants. 200 languages are spoken in this city. There's some neighborhood cities like Mississauga, for example, where most people speak Urdu at home, because they're of Pakistani origin. So this is quite phenomenal. This is a city of 1 million people we're talking about, like a mushroom city that has grown very quickly over the last years. So I thought of a project that could be called Demographics with a hyphen. Demo, as you know, comes from the Greek word demos, which is the public sphere, the space of the common, and graphics comes from the Greek word graphikos, which means all forms of traces. So this is an interesting way of getting rid of the canons of Occidental art history, which separate different forms, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, etc. We can think of art today as encompassing different mediums, different types of traces and forms, without any hierarchy or separation between them. So demographics was meant to address this question, but also address these pockets of the urban landscape that are influenced by this important history of migrations in Canada, including not only the recent migrations, which are phenomenal since the 90s, but the historical migrations, which start with the indigenous migrations from Asia to Canada many millenniums ago. And then the European migrations, etc., especially starting in the 17th century and going on until the 20th, when we had many post-war migrations from Europe also. And then we had Vietnamese migrations at one point, and we had Haitian migrations, which are still continuing very much at this point, for example. So our cities are marked, there are intensities of these different migrations which manifest themselves in our cities. So, and the idea of the demographics project was to identify areas and identify spaces like schools, hospitals, daycare centers, refugee centers, stores, whatever, that could be interesting places to ask artists to work in, to work with, and also to work with the people that use these spaces. So I'll go on to speak about, since I'm not living in Toronto anymore, I transformed this project for it to have a more local component while maintaining the global component that the demographics projects also had. And I called it Spheres. And why Spheres? Because you can think that each and every one of us, we are an individual sphere, you know, the Venn diagram, connected to other spheres. And that brings up the question of the common. How do these individual spheres interconnect and what is produced in that in between, or in that connection, or at those crossroads. So also a sphere can be a territory identified in the city where there's an intensity that manifests itself for one reason or another, either because, like here in Montreal, we now have since about 15 years a space, an area called Little Maghreb, because a lot of people from north of Africa have settled there, and it's changed completely the urban landscape. So, and there's a lot of examples. There's Ville Saint-Laurent, where the Lebanese came after the war in the 70s, and they they created a new urban landscape in that area. So the idea is not to invite artists from Lebanon, let's say, in the Lebanese area of Greater Montreal, or I don't know, Kader Adiam, my dear friend, to work in Little Maghreb, but to try to see who would be interested to work in these different spaces, wherever they come from, be it Finland or the Congo, let's say, so that we find out, in a way we can learn from this process where the world might be going, what new ways of thinking are brought about by creating crossroads of this kind. I should say, I forgot to mention that the first idea of calling the project Spheres with an S in Montreal came from the fact that we have one building here which has become very emblematic of postmodern times in Montreal. It was the building built in the context of the Universal Exhibition in 1967, held here. And one of the buildings which remains is the Pavilion of the United States that was designed by Buckminster Fuller. It's a geodesic dome. It was the biggest one that he'd ever built. And if you look at the architectural principles of that geodesic dome, following Fuller's thinking, they're all about what he calls tensional integrity. So it's about things holding together by connectivity. So this is what I think we're all striving for, to see not only construct a world that works with connectivity, but to see how really that functions or what that produces. So that was another dimension coming into the idea of spheres. There are there's a DNA, be it in the demographics project or in the spheres project, built on three concepts: hospitality. Besides the demography, there's also hospitality and sharing. And these are very important concepts to weave together in the governance of this project. If we think about Jacques Derrida, for example, he linked very much the concept of hospitality with that of culture and ethics. I feel they are really endemic, that we cannot deal with culture or art without also thinking that this should be a place for the development of a continuously ethical stance, which, in other words, you could also call the building of a cosmopolitics, which is a word that I prefer using than talking about diversity and multiculturalism. As I said, I don't like isms of any kind. So this word cosmopolitics suits me. Voilà, thank you very much. I hope I wasn't too...
Gracias, Chantal. Gracias, Chantal, y gracias a todos.
Thank you very much, Chantal, and thank you all. In our polyphonic approach that we always try to present, this was very well presented today. And in these decentralized outlooks, in all cases, there is a critical perspective that aims at looking for different paths or walking down other different territories within the world of art. In a way, we also try to find an answer to what the need is for our positioning in our space. So in all cases, there are a number of notions that repeated itself in notions in connection to canon, creating other paths of circulations, revisiting notions between art and politics, and repositioning art from critical perspectives. I've seen you all in tension writing down a number of things, and I was asked by Annibal, he wants to take the floor. Anna wrote lots of things, Sebastian and Carlos as well. So I'd like to circulate the floor. Many things, many interesting things were stated, and of course, museums got challenged and how we work, very many of us work in museums, so that is a place we have a lot to discuss. And the canon is very much present in the work that Carlos does, and also in the perspective that Parachute sustained over many years, and in Francis and Sebastian's considerations. I'll give the floor to Annibal, and then Anna will continue. Thank you, Diana. Before anything else, Chantal, I'd like to thank you for having mentioned Jorge Brusberg. He's been a remarkable personality in the world of culture in Argentina, and many times he is not sufficiently well considered. He's not been paid enough recognition. As you said, Diana, there is this polyphonic approach, and the consideration here, what I consider based on a number of things, based on what Anna considered, especially what is being done in the Reina Sofia Museum, and based on what Barthélemy Togo is doing as well, is basically depending on what we say. We want it to be different. I mean, the world after the pandemic, we want it to be different. We want to see whether we can draw some advantage from such a tragic incident. I believe that we should consider, and it might be some specific issue for a meeting, how can we go about thinking that this can bring about change? Because as a matter of fact, and if I follow everything virtually, whatever is going on in the world of art, you see so many different expressions that try to change the world of art and culture in post-pandemic, and the same number of expressions that try to keep the status quo, that is, for everything to remain unchanged. Anna was saying, and I don't remember whether while we were on air or in our previous talk, the museum suffered because it didn't have that many visitors. School children or tourists didn't visit it anymore. This relates to what we have talked about a few times before. How is it that museums have become excessively dependent on commercial movements as well as on tourism? They depend on the box office sale, so to speak. So we should think the following: how is it that we can go about approaching this? There are two possibilities to consider here. Everything will remain in wishful thinking, that is, in a number of thoughts expressed on how we need for things to change. But without any doubt, those thoughts in the world we are living in, managed by capitalistic criteria, may fall quite suddenly against what have been expressed here that stem from many other statements that in other virtual environments you can get to see, and basically based on the commercial needs in the world of art. We all are in favor of a number of commercial needs in the world of art because, of course, art has to be a market in and of itself, because this is the way in which artists can make a living. But many times we've been critical of how this market became frivolized and how the world of art became a frivolous, so to speak. So Anna will surely answer this quickly. How is it that we can go about, or if we find a way in which the world of museums can become different from what it is right now? Thank you, Annibal. I'd like to go back to Chantal's question. She feels uneasy with the current day museum. I fully agree with you on that one, Chantal. This is completely related or connected to how the modern project of museums has been worn and torn, so to speak. How this institution appointed to gather heritage, to give it value, to put together a collection and generate a narrative around that number of objects and practices, for that matter. Without a doubt, that museum model is totally under crisis today more than ever before. It is challenged, and it is in the subject matter of critique. I am convinced that we should not give up on the existence of museums. We don't have to be forced to the old model of museums, but rather to claim museums as a public forum. Museums as capable of having a critical incidence, being spaces that can be vectors where thoughts are articulated, where collective thinking and common work is done. So on that point, this would be a linchpin of these institutions so that they can give way to other type of political and artistic projects inside their walls. And when it comes to that, I'd like to go to what Sebastian said in terms of toponymia. It relates to how we name things, and interventions of all of us here laid emphasis on challenging a number of codes that were quite binary in nature: center, periphery, local and global, masculine and feminine. A number of binomial concepts came about, and we want to just challenge. And Sebastian's idea of how to name in Mapuche language, how to name from a different perspective and from other genealogies, from other political configurations, can also help articulate new constellations or ways of inhabiting the world: water, body, language, territory, that constellation that he put forward based on this toponymia. So on that point, I believe, going back to Annibal's considerations here, I don't want to be naive at all. So I'd like to insist on something that I said in the beginning in connection to the part that we are perfectly aware of the fact that Reina Sofia Museum, in spite of it having embarked in this project, in this complex project, where we are rethinking the institutional ways and re-articulating common spaces with other collective groups and other territories and projects, it continues to take up the tradition it had behind its back: a museum with a collection, with a heritage, and that has an incidence on market phenomena beyond our will, as Anibal was saying, and that it communicates a narrative that has a very strong effect on building legitimacy. So without disregarding that ballast, so to speak, that thing that it drags behind, or the enormous role that Reina Sofia Museum has in the community it is placed in, considering the touristic gentrification that is reconfiguring the possibility of inhabiting the neighborhood, and proximity with Reina Sofia is one of the values, of course, that give it more scale to the neighborhood. We don't have to be naive to the contradiction that we are all part of. So being critical to these ways of cognitive capitalism, not to be naive in connection to the role that the museum takes up, inhabiting this condition without neglecting it or ignoring it, but rather taking full ownership of that battle that is part of our own daily logic considerations. I'd like to go back to something that Chantal considered, the in-between, what is in the middle, and that contradiction can be a gap towards the future, some sort of crack hole in connection to the more ankylosed, standardized, old ways that are deeply rooted, and then generate a crack or a gap, and then they can shape themselves up as something that shakes things up, that give way, going back to the metaphor of water by Sebastian, that generates some sort of dam or dike that can make it blow up. Thank you, Ana. Well, the issue of the in-between, this is one of the considerations that appeared on Chantal's presentation, and I believe that it surrounds in a good way several of the intentions that are part of the basis of our projects. And at the same time, I wanted to invite Sebastian so he can comment on an aspect of what he does work on. And this is implicit on what you presented, but it is quite interesting in terms of the discussion that gave way to your work. How is it that identities are occupied and reoccupied? And how is it that the ways in which politically speaking they are occupied, and how, from your perspective, you reversion the whole thing? It's been quite important to revisit the file, the historical file, how the bodies have been created in the past, in the present, and towards the future. In the Mapuche world, as I would say, in native people, future is quite uncertain. It is just not possible because of colonialism. Several aspects talk about impossibility of the future based on whatever has been in the construction of the past. So it's been quite remarkable for me to work based on historical records. I was focused on the sexual record that is finding different ways of thinking about gender and sexuality before colonial times, and also at the current day and age, not just to name something today, but also to know that there's this concept that Anna was referring to, the crack hole, being so important indeed. Revisiting history has to do with revisiting how bodies have been built and the memories around territories, this being fundamental in rethinking the future. We first have to rewrite that history, not the colonial one that has been written without us, but with us, from our voices, from our own experience. And I also wanted to revisit something that Anna and Chantal mentioned. These are fundamental concepts for this. The first concept, Anna mentioned it, on situating yourself, placing yourself. For my work, it's been quite remarkable and fundamental because it means two things at the same time, knowing what the beginning is of what you can talk about or where you can work, and at the same time, know the end, what's the boundary of my identity, my body, or my inclusion in a territory, I as a social subject with others, in order to talk. And that is quite nice because I believe that the current day and age, where many times the multicultural system that is this system that includes all of us, but which in reality only leaves us with systems with quotas. It's some sort of thing where from the spaces of the more activist art or Aboriginal art, they consider us as exotic subjects, but they don't want to have us as political subjects. I'm not interested in being the quota that the museum would like to show on the space. I would rather like the museum for it to open up dialogues, generate connections with other places so that my work is read together with others. It shouldn't be part of a quota to show work in order to expiate the colonial guilt that they have, because this is what ends up having. I mean, there is some sort of accumulated guilt that art institutions want to get rid of. They want to wash out this from their shoulders. How do they do it? Placing a number of people on their exhibitions just to say or to claim they are not racists or patriarchal, but those people have no incidence or collective voice, nor are they becoming a greater and more powerful movement. So institutions and people at the same time should get decolonized. And I'm not saying this as an act on which I or any other people don't have to follow the same lead. We all have to follow the same lead because we are all very much transversed by this highly racistic and patriarchal system. That's true, no doubt. And along those lines, what Carlos has been doing with his entire team, trying to decolonize or to get rid of colonialism, destructure canon and make it explode from the School of Fine Arts. And at the same time, this effort of bringing to a site that had been neglected by some part of society, Peruvian society, to make it go back to the center in order to be part of the tests that the school has been doing, also walk down the same line, exercising in decolonizing or disarticulating these inertias where things have been up and running, but also this work that for quite too long, many of us have been attempting to have. Carlos, you are muted. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. What I was saying is that undoubtedly this is difficult. And I would relate it to Anibal's question and the one that you have put forward on possible futures. In Peru, we have another traumatic experience. In the 1980s and 90s, we had the terrorist phenomenon in a very strong manner through a group that was called Sendero Luminoso that disappeared the public space in the 1980s, early 1990s, because through murdering practices, the police and bomb cars, especially in Lima, this is the experience I could talk about. We abandoned the public space for fear. Fear stopped us from using common spaces, and it stopped us from exercising our full citizenship. And then what came along was the Fujimorist government that was highly interested with a more vertical approach. Initially, so we regarded it well because it put an end to the terrorist phenomenon. But what happened immediately after was that he modified the constitution and it became far more neoliberal. Our constitution became neoliberal. And I think that that lack of public space was taken advantage of, and we thought, people thought of a social structure where citizens expected to be solved a problem, such as terrorism was solved. They expected the state to solve other problems, the market or the state, through a constitution and a far more neoliberal proposal where the idea of consumption and exchange, the selling and the buying became increasingly stronger. So this idea of repression meant by putting an end to terrorism, which was a continuity of the lack of public space, generated in turn in Peru a lack of political discourse that was quite strong in the Peruvian political phenomenon. The lack of political discourse generated the lack of an exchange of ideas on the public arena, and that, of course, affected art as well. So it's been quite difficult in Peru to try and recover the open discussion, the coexistence of ideas in a dynamic manner through critical, sustained thinking. It's been quite difficult, I should say. And along those lines, what we have done in our school has to do with those liabilities, so to speak, how to find in those liabilities a number of stereotypes, not just canons, but also stereotypes that do exist as well through preconceived ideas on art and on artistic practices, which, as on the first paragraph I said, are crossed by this social division that can be seen in Peru, and how these create a situation that is some sort of labyrinth that has to be undone, so to speak. So the tensions typical that can be created when harnessing on such differences are quite interesting indeed, because it is based on this tension that exists between modern and postmodern proposals in the limeño world. We try to add what Sebastian has been doing based on the Mapuche proposal, which I highly commend. We also have a professor, Javi Vargas, who does research on this idea of the Choque Chinchay, this idea of the pre-Hispanic cosmogony in Peru. And this relates to eradicating this idea of the bipolar notion in gender dimensions. It just talks about many genders, and it is quite interesting. I'm talking about Javi Vargas' investigation and research. This leads me into thinking about the possibilities that we have when we think about these practices, the more ancestral practices, and the community. It does not stay at the human level, but it moves on to nature as well. And I believe that this, in a way, is the factor that has unleashed or triggered the crisis that we are having today through the pandemic. And I'd like to close this part by saying that what happened in the 80s or in the 90s in Peru, the crisis was taken advantage of in this lack of public space, this dependency that became existing among people. They depended on the state for the state to solve problems for them. And it was taken advantage by a political movement or an anti-political movement because they took advantage of this lack of critical space. And based on our own Peruvian experience, there was some sort of pessimism of whatever could happen. And I'd like to go to this idea, the experience that Sebastian highlighted, where there are spaces in between the cracks, as Chantal and Anna were saying, and these are the possibilities that contemporary art can provide us with, can give us. And these spaces to engage in dialogue are the ones that can provide us with a different alternative so that we can think about possible futures. Thank you. I was thinking about this underscoring on naming things or renaming things. And I was thinking about the terms of the video Togo when he said, we are the ones that need to add value and set our own price as a way to take action in the international market by taking power. And I was also thinking about the whole melting pot of nationalities that were part of the platform that, or the reality that took Chantal, drove her into thinking about her project, Spheres. And I also thought about the specific situation of work by Francis on an island that, as you duly stated, is situated less than 100 kilometers from Africa, 1,700 kilometers away from Madrid, and yet it is related to Latin America. So I was thinking about how history comes down to assist us and to become very much present as some sort of ballast water, or what museums drag from behind, from their own history, and the capacity of turning this into a virtue. The vice turns itself into a virtue, critical space for critical thinking, and with all these materials to think about possible futures, which is the image that has gathered us in the last few meetings. Would anyone like to add anything? We are right on time. I'd like to conclude my part by saying the following, saying that based on all the things that were considered here and what we have heard, I'd like to say that I keep thinking about this idea of what we can understand about the margins, the idea of failure, and the idea of accepting failure as an alternative to walk away from the labyrinth where we are. We live on an island, so traveling is fundamental for us. We need to travel, and through travel, I discovered different new formats. For quite too long, I've been more attentive as an artist to the Western formulas. I'm living in Europe, and for quite too long, I've been moving down to Latin America or visiting Latin America. And in different places in Latin America, I discovered potential and a way of understanding this, which has been called art, has been a failure and which has to be reconsidered. We have to reconsider about all failures, a cultural failure that we are seeing at all times. We see in new generations, educational failure that is primarily promoted by attitudes that have to do with our participation. There is political failure, new liberalism, how it has abducted us all, driving us to extremes such as the ones we are at, especially in Latin America, where, for instance, Chile, being a country that, in a way, I feel myself Chilean very much, because not because of a country over another, but because of friendships I have with Chilean people and with sentimental bonds. The same is true with Bolivia and with Ecuador. There is failure as well in relation to the recognition of the social component. There is failure in respect for nature, lack of respect on the part of all of us, and culture and art in general is just a vital attitude, and this vital attitude that we take ownership of with a number of intermediaries. Sometimes it's not just us artists, but others who intermediate for us, make that through a number of interlocutors, we can rewrite the future and re-understand it in a different way. We can modify it based on that acceptance of the fact that, of course, there are many models that are failing. I myself, personally speaking, I think that this pandemic won't make us any stronger, but it'll make us weaker, and it won't shape us any different. This pandemic, after some time has elapsed, we will just have passed unnoticed. We don't have any historical memory. We live in Spain and we don't have any historical memory. And chances are that nothing will happen based on this, and everything will be twisted. We are seeing a situation where everything can be twisted and misinterpreted, and the mass media are doing their part right now. And that's another part of the machinery. So I'm filled with doubt in connection to failure. And I can take this idea and then reconsider ourselves and go into those different worlds that are quite important for us, mentally speaking. Culture and education have to walk hand in hand. This is quite complex. It's a matter of putting together quite a discourse around this. And of course, time is limited. I don't want to take up any more time to say this. And thank you all for your visions, because they have all been very enriching and they are fundamental, especially at this day and age. And I'd like to thank you, BIENALSUR, as well. Thank you. Aníbal? So am I bound to close? I was thinking that we are older in this group, and we came down to art through different paths. Diana from the point of view of theory, Chantal as well, others, in my case, from the door of being collectors. This is why I'm such critical of the frivolous nature of this world, of which I am a part as well. And from the political activism or from the practice in order to try and change a society, to criticize it and attempt change in it. In many cases, in meetings, when we are asked, why is it that we devote so much time to artistic or cultural things? One of the answers is because art and culture in general won't change society, but they make people think. And based on that, we do have possibilities for many things to change. And maybe now we go to a different situation, and maybe from the places where we are at in the world of art and culture, we have to think about the way, not just of changing or influencing in the minds of people, but then how to make this influence flourish in specific changes, so that, as Francis was saying, quite rightfully so, that we should think that this has been so serious that then it'll change everything and then nothing will ever change. Before coming down to the place where I am, when I say here, I'm referring to the 3 de Febrero University. I was reading news on the Lebanon where they were saying that a new government will be chosen, but this will be done based on traditional basis, meaning that whatever such a big disgrace has brought about us, the one in Lebanon with thousands of devastated households and with such a high death toll, won't really be a catalyst for any type of change. And I was listening to Francis' remarks, and that reminded me of Lebanon. And that is the risk we all run. And in that risk, we have to place all of our will so that this will just not happen in this way, so that commercial interests and box office interests, as well as frivolous interests, and those that relate to those who use art as a way to become a jet set member or a celebrity, well, we should try to see whether there is any way that can spare that outcome from us. So if this is a closing, or if I'm bound to close because we are past the time assigned, and even though it would be very nice to keep talking for quite a long time, time is limited because of the burnout that translators may have and the limits that this impose on us. I'd like to thank those who participated very much, to thank them for joining us virtually, sharing their questions and sharing very interesting comments. And I'd also like to thank those that participated virtually so as well, but on the screen, to say that this is part of an effort that we have been carrying out with very little means, with a lot of will and with a lot of burden, with a very small team of people led by Diana and myself. And we are really committed so that BIENALSUR will continue to exist, so that it will continue to grow increasingly. But it is not out of the whim of wanting to see grow those things that we have given life to or that we have created, but rather because we are convinced that BIENALSUR has much more to do with the world that we want to see come down rather than with the world of old. So thank you all, and we'll see each other next time. Thank you so much and see you soon.